Now that we have discussed the persistent question of the origin of Ashkenazi Jewry in the previous video, let's go straight to Khazaria and try to understand what exactly do we know about the story of the conversion of the Khazars in that region, possibly in the 8th century. The story of Khazaria is especially fascinating when you think about the way it has been received by Jewish history. This is what the German historians call it, the Rezeptionsgeschichte, or the history of the reception, how an idea is formed and developed and spread around. Perhaps the most important element of the Rezeptionsgeschichte, wow, it's hard to say, of the Khazar conversion is this book, the Kuzari, written by Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, very, very important Spanish Jewish thinker in the 12th century. The story described in the Kuzari is essentially the story of the Khazar conversion as this great poet and philosopher developed into a massive book. The story goes like this. Basically, there is this King Bulan who somewhere around the year 740 is, a very spiritual individual and concerned with the practice of paganism among his people and looking at the growth of monotheistic movements, particularly Christianity and Islam. And both Christianity and Islam are making geographic headway in Central Asia and approaching his borders. And he thinks to himself, oh, so what should I be doing? Should I be remaining a pagan? Should I join one of these other faiths and so on? And so he has a debate where he brings together a Jew, a Muslim, and a Christian. I know it sounds like an offensive joke, but it's not. And he has them have a trilateral debate over which religion is superior. In the end, as you might expect, given the fact that this is Rabbi Yehuda Halevi writing it, King Bulan decides to accept Judaism, and all of his court and the Kuzari, the Khazarian people, ultimately follow him into Judaism. That's essentially the story. Now, I hope you noticed that there is 500 years difference between the setting of this story and the authorship of the Kuzari. That's half a millennium. That's a lot of time. And we have to understand that the Kuzari was chosen as a subject for Rabbi Yehuda Halevi because of circumstances in the Iberian Peninsula in his day, specifically the trilateral relationship between Jews, Muslims, and Christians, which was very unique to Spain and Portugal. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi essentially used the story of the conversion of the Khazars as a kind of a literary foil to have a larger philosophical discussion about the relative merits of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And then, of course, by doing so, to demonstrate the superiority of Judaism. That's the essential idea of the Kuzari, and the actual historical elements of the conversion of the Khazars is not necessarily important for what Rabbi Yehuda Halevi wanted to achieve in his literary work. So let us set aside the Kuzari as a historical source. It's definitely not intended to serve as a historical source. It's intended to serve as a literary philosophical source. Let's try to go back and understand what we do know about the period. So let's move back a couple hundred years to the correspondence of Chastai ibn Shaprut. Again, we're still about 300 years distant from the actual events described, but this is a fascinating and very important source, which was exceptionally important for Yehuda Halevi's work as well. Chastai ibn Shaprut, who I hope we will discuss in a few lectures when we look at Spain in the 10th century, very important diplomat who communicated with Jewish communities throughout the Mediterranean basin. And he was fascinated with the story of the Khazar conversion, which was known to him. And so he sent out some emissaries to try and reach Khazaria and find out, what's going on there? Are you guys actually Jewish? Is this actually a Jewish kingdom? Now, for reasons which will take us beyond the scope of our discussion, his emissaries did not succeed in reaching Khazaria or speaking with any actual Khazarians, but they did receive correspondence from someone who purported to have brought letters from a King Joseph of Khazaria. These letters are absolutely fascinating. They relate the story of the conversion of King Bulan. They talk about the nature of Khazarians, their Judaism, and all kinds of fascinating things. But it's widely believed that these letters were forgeries. In other words, the people who provided the letters to the messengers of Chastai ibn Shaprut were essentially engaged in some kind of con. And they have no bearing on the actuality of Khazaria, and they don't have historical value for that purpose. So they're fascinating and they're really engaging, but are they real? Are they authentic? Are they actually letters from King Joseph? Probably not. We do know, however, as we get closer and closer to the original dates, that there were medieval Jewish travelers who either had direct contact with Khazaria or direct contact with Khazarians in different places and report, however briefly, on their Jewish status, sometimes with a degree of surprise, sometimes with a degree of skepticism, but nevertheless, there's like more and more little tiny bits of evidence piling up in a lot of places. As we shall see, many skeptics would say that the plural of anecdote is not data, but it's hard to toss away these little bits of information. For example, here's a fascinating document which was found in the Cairo Geniza. We will have opportunity to speak about what that Geniza is in a few lectures from now, but basically it's a medieval trove of documents which were literally thrown away, but were amazingly preserved till they were unearthed in the late 19th century. And in this trove of documents is the so-called Kievan Letter, which is basically a letter that is familiar to anyone who lives in a Jewish community today. When tzedakah collectors, when charity collectors come by Jewish homes, they typically present a document which is called a petek, and it's essentially a statement of the bona fides of the bearer of the document, saying that this person represents a legitimate cause, he's fallen on hard times, he's supporting orphans and widows or a charitable cause, one or the other. And it's expected that when someone presents you with this petek, which may be issued by the local community in which the donor lives, or it may come from the originating community, like from Jerusalem or wherever, then you give them charity and they build up their cause. So this is exactly one of those documents. The only real difference between this document and the ones we use today is that the ones we use today are laminated typically. This was not laminated, but it comes from Kiev, which indicates that that was part of the range of Khazaria. In fact, the great Harvard historian Omelian Pritsak argued that Kiev may have been founded by Khazarian Jews, believe it or not. At any rate, the letter, which comes from Kiev, specifically describes how the person has fallen at hard times and the person is worthy, and you should specifically support his cause. And then, amazingly, at the bottom, you can see it's highlighted here in this particular image, there is a signature in what appear to be Turkic runes that say, "I have read it," or "we have read it." It's fascinating. That indicates that there was evidently people who, because normally this would be the signature of someone who was important in the Jewish community, like a rabbi or the parnas of the community, which is essentially the president of the community, and he obviously is completely illiterate in Hebrew and needs to write in Turkic runes, which would be very unusual unless there was a distinct Khazaric community in Kiev at the time. We have multiple references from Arab historians to a Jewish presence in Khazaria as well. And perhaps one of my favorite examples is in one of the most important early historical documents that describe the origins of the Kievan Rus population, which later would grow into modern-day Ukraine. It's also shared with the Russian Empire and the Polish Empire and so on. It's the so-called Povest Vremeniach Liet, or Chronicle of Bygone Years, which is essentially a church record of the history of the region, there is a fascinating description of a key element in the Christianization of the region, specifically the conversion of King Volodymyr, or Vladimir, to Eastern Orthodox Christianity. And amazingly, it's exactly like the story in the Kuzari. There is a representative of Islam. There are two representatives of Christianity, both Western and Eastern Christianity. And there is a representative of the Jews, and that representative is specifically a Khazarian Jew. And this is absolutely fascinating that not only do they replicate the story that is essentially told in the letters of Chastai ibn Shaprut with King Joseph, they actually report the same kind of scenario. Of course, it ends up that King Volodymyr decides to become Christian rather than Jewish. Could you imagine how history would have changed had he chosen to be Jewish? He very nearly did, by the way. But this is, one of those data points that's really hard to ignore, speaking to the idea of a Jewish community in Khazaria at the time. And then finally, we've got some really tempting archaeological finds, like this coin found in the United Kingdom as part of the so-called Spillings hoard. There's a whole number of them that come from Khazaria around this time, like 8th, 9th century. This one writes in Arabic, a sort of a paraphrase on the famous statement of Islamic faith. There is no God but Allah, and Moses is his prophet. Right? That's an unusual kind of statement there. And then there are some tempting examples of Jewish symbols on Khazar architecture, which is limited. There are not a lot of finds, but this menorah symbol from a Khazar archaeological dig is especially tempting. So all of these things come together to suggest that something really important happened in this region in the 8th century that involved Judaism. But what exactly happened? Let's have a look at that. If you ask Professor Shaul Stampfer, who we met in the last lecture when we were talking about DNA evidence, Dr. Stampfer is definitely one of the biggest skeptics of the whole story. He says it is, quote, a splendid story, right? You can finish the rest of that sentence. In other words, there's not much to it. So, but we still have all these little bits of data, the Kievan Letter, the Spillings hoard coin, and things like that. What does all that mean? So trying to put it together, one of the biggest questions we have is, if they did convert to Judaism, and I tend to believe something happened there with regards to conversion, why did they convert? There does not seem to be a really good source to provide an answer for this. Besides, of course, the letter of King Joseph to Chastai ibn Shaprut, widely regarded as a forgery, but in that letter, the primary motivation was essentially spiritual in nature, and that's very nice, but maybe I've been a historian too long. I tend to be skeptical of such things. It's also possible that maybe it had to do with the geopolitics of the era. The Khazars did fight two brutal wars with the Muslims. They did see the rapid expanse of Christianity, which would overtake Ukraine, then Kievan Rus, in short order. So, maybe they chose to adopt Judaism as some kind of potentially neutral position. Perhaps they hope to say that, hey, Jews are tolerated in Muslim lands under the Pact of Umar, which we discussed earlier, and in Christian lands through the doctrine of witness. Maybe they thought they could carve out some independence there. But we also have to remember that there is remarkable silence regarding their association with the massive Jewish population in Mesopotamia, which is really not so far away. This was really the world center of Jewish intellect and rabbinics and writing and so on. Why is there silence from Mesopotamia on the Khazar conversion? Who converted them? If not the rabbis active in Babylonia and Mesopotamia, was it the Karaites, who we haven't had the opportunity to discuss yet? Why do we have no Karaite sources either? So a lot of questions about why they would convert. Secondly, how Jewish was this conversion, both in terms of quality and in terms of quantity. I mentioned already that we don't have a clear sense as to whether these converts were rabbinic in orientation or Karaite in orientation. The documents like the Kievan Letter just indicate that that particular individual who had gone to Egypt with the purpose of raising funds had fallen on hard times, but it doesn't really say much about his personal religious orientation. We don't really have clear evidence as to what kind of Judaism they performed. We also, very importantly, don't know how many of them became Jewish. Is it possible that this was kind of like a royal conversion, like we see, for example, with Queen Helena of Adiabene, who converted to Judaism with her sons, but her husband remained non-Jewish? Is it possibly similar to the conversion in Chimyar in the Arabian Peninsula? We simply don't know how many of Khazarian Jews converted to Judaism. And it could be that this was simply a token conversion that took place in the upper strata. It did not extend to the lower population as a whole, who remained essentially pagan. We don't know. And thirdly, perhaps contributing to the ongoing mystery about the Khazars, what happened to them? Right? Where did they go? We know that the empire lost its political independence in the 10th century when Sviatoslav of Kievan Rus destroyed it for the last time. But they seem to pop up every now and then in the Chronicle of Bygone Years. That was a couple of hundred years later. We still have reference to Khazars as Jews, but they don't seem to have that impact on the demographics of the region. We already discussed in the previous video the lack of DNA evidence of their continuing relationship with Ashkenazi Jews. Did they perhaps make an impact on some of the smaller Jewish populations in the Caucasus, like the mountain Jews perhaps? We simply don't know. Now, as I mentioned in the beginning of the last video, I get a lot of questions and a lot of attention about the Khazar. Sometimes I have to actually shut off the comments because they just get way out of hand. And you might wonder, if this is your first time encountering this question, why would people care, right? What is the big deal? Some obscure 8th century event? So the implications are actually quite significant for 21st century politics. If you consider, for example, the work of Professor Shlomo Zand, who is an Israeli historian who has written quite a few controversial books. One of the most significant is this one here, the so-called The Invention of the Jewish People, in which he essentially argues that Ashkenazi Jews, as we discussed in the last video, Ashkenazi Jews are not really Jewish. That this entire sub-ethnic group of the Jewish people, which had such a profound impact on modern politics in particular, since the 19th century in particular, they're not actually descended from the biblical Jews of ancient Israel. Now, this has a lot of appeal to people who wish to see modern Jews taken down a peg. Maybe for religious reasons, that they want to feel that modern Ashkenazi Jews don't have a real share in the ancient patrimony that they claim. Again, not that it really makes a difference in terms of Jewish law, and although I'm not a theologian, I'm not even sure what kind of difference it would make theologically. The argument of some people, frankly, anti-Semites, that modern Jews are not real Jews is a way of delegitimizing their ethnic identity and of saying that we don't have to afford them the respect that their ancient patrimony might otherwise be appropriate for them. We don't have to regard them as being, millennial followers of an ancient tradition, and perhaps therefore, we don't have to even apply the doctrine of witness to them. We could consider them usurpers, racial interlopers who have somehow taken away the true patrimony. You'd see this sometimes among black supremacists who argue that the real Jews are actually black, and those white Jews who claim to be Jews, they can't be Jews because we are, right? That's, as we've discussed when we looked at the Jews of Africa, there are Jews who are black as well, and it's just not it's not a factor in the theological or the halachic application of who is a Jew, halachic being in terms of Jewish law. So a lot of anti-Semites really like the Khazarian hypothesis, and for people like Professor Zahn, they also see kind of like a liberal approach to this as well. The right wing may see it in terms of traditional anti-Semitic views. The left wing, as we see Professor Zahn, he wishes to disassociate himself specifically with the Jewish claim to the land of Israel. If Ashkenazi Jews, the argument goes, are not really Jewish, and Israel is to be a homeland for Jews, that therefore, in the way the argument goes, invalidates the Ashkenazi claim to the land of Israel as their homeland. And that's a pretty strong thing to state politically, and that's why, ironically, you sometimes find the Khazarian hypothesis being advanced by those who have issue with Jews both on the right and on the left. That's why this issue seems to have so much traction, even in the 21st century. But in terms of the overall scope of Jewish history, it's just a tiny little footnote, a fascinating one, a splendid story, to use Dr. Stamfer's message. But we're going to move on from this now, and we're going to look at a much more significant topic. We're going to look at the growth of Middle Eastern Jewry, and particularly we're going to look at the Gaonic period. Thank you very much for watching.